Good day, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's program, Pedagogies for Justice, a conversation with educators and organizers. My name is Lesley Williams. I'm a consultant with Parceo, and I will be moderating this conversation. Many thanks to our webinar hosts, Haymarket and Parceo. Parceo, co-directed by Nina Mehta and Donna Neville, is a community research, resource, and education center that partners with a wide range of social justice groups, schools, universities, unions, religious and cultural institutions to strengthen our collective work for justice. Part of Parceo's work has included partnering with organizations to develop social justice curricula and workshops. Recent examples include Project 48, the Palestinian Nakba curriculum, workshops on intersecting injustices, including anti-Muslim racism, disability justice, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, and anti-Palestinian racism, and our curriculum on anti-Semitism from a framework of collective liberation, developed with educators and leaders from our justice communities in response to the current moment. In all of its work, Parceo brings a commitment to the transformative power of community and political education, integral to our organizing and work for justice. We're holding this discussion today with panelists who each bring that commitment to their different areas of work. As you'll see, our panel is composed of educators, some who have taught in traditional classrooms or at universities, others who focus on community education tied to activism. At a time when teachers and activists are facing extreme suppression and pressure to depoliticize the classroom, how do activists, union organizers, and community educators unite these roles to combat rising fascism? How does education influence organizing and vice versa? Joining me today as we dig into these questions are 5 incredible leaders in both educating and organizing, and I'm honored to introduce them to you now. First, we have Mizue Aizeki, the founder and executive director of the Collaborative Research Center for Resilience, which includes projects such as the Surveillance Resistance Lab and the Everywhere Border Project. For nearly 20 years, Mizue has focused on the injustices at the intersections of the criminal and migration control systems. Mizue is the co-editor of Resisting Borders and Technology of Violence, and her photography appears in the books Dying to Live, A Story of U.S. Immigration in an Age of Global Apartheid, and Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter. Mizue, we're honored to have you with us today. Next, we have Maya Suzuki Daniels, an educator and organizer living in San Pedro, California. Since beginning her career in education, she has worked in a variety of educational settings, private, charter, district, and non-traditional schools. She believes in honoring our elders, involving our children in community spaces, and bringing theory to the people. Maya, welcome, and thank you for joining us. Next, we have Lara Kiswani, Executive Director of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, which serves and organizes poor and working class Arabs and Muslims across the San Francisco Bay Area. AROC advances immigrant and refugee rights, youth organizing, and community defense against militarism and racism, while building campaigns for educational justice and ethnic studies. Lara is also a faculty member in the College of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University and a member of the California Faculty Association. Honored to have you with us, Lara. Next, we have Mary Najimi, an anti-racist educator and labor leader. She's a founding member of the Institute for the Understanding of Anti-Palestinian Racism, former president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, and a co-founder of the Caucus Educators for Palestine and the National Education Association, the largest union in the country. Thank you so much for joining us, Mary. And our last panelist is Rebecca Vilcomerson, co-director of Funding Freedom, organizing within philanthropy to support Palestinian liberation. She was executive director of Jewish Voice for Peace from 2009 to 2019, and her book, Solidarity is the Political Version of Love, Lessons from Jewish Anti-Zionist Organizing, was published in 2024. She serves on the boards of Showing Up for Racial Justice and her Brooklyn Synagogue. And I also want to introduce Parceo's co-director, Nina Mehta, who will be closing out our conversation. She's a community educator who, in addition to her work with Parceo, has taught in public schools and universities and has been part of many alternative and participatory education projects locally and globally. And I just want to take a second to acknowledge the wealth of experience, excellence, and brilliance in this room today. So what do we want to talk about here today? As I said in my introduction, we're looking at how pedagogy and education impact organizing and the ways we can connect and build upon our collective struggles for justice. How do we learn and share our learning from our organizing in ways that broaden and deepen our movements? So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to respond to that question, and then I'll have another series of questions. So let's kick it off with Lara.
Did you want to ask the question, or should I just get right into it?
You can just get right into it.
Well, the question around education and organizing is something that's really close to my heart, because for me, organizing is where theory becomes real, where we test our assumptions, put our values into practice, learn from contradictions, and constantly are pushed to learn and grow, not just as individuals, but as organizations, as communities, as movements, in service of building real power. And arguably, nothing matters more in this moment than building the power necessary to transform society. For most of my life, being a product of the public school system, I've learned most not through the textbooks, but my actual experience in the classroom. And I carry with me Freire's idea that real learning requires both action and reflection, right? It's not enough to move. We have to pause. We have to analyze. We have to ask ourselves, what worked, what didn't, who was centered, who was left out, where did we gain some ground, where did we miss some steps, and what did we learn about power? And so for me, that kind of reflection, when done collectively, makes our movement stronger, makes us more intentional, makes us more grounded. And in moments like these questions are more critical than ever. There is a concerted effort by those in power to effectively erase and get rid in this country of the most marginalized communities: Palestinians, Black, Indigenous, trans, immigrant, Latinx, API communities. And obviously, those closest to the problem are also closest to the solution. So how are we ensuring that we're centering the voices of those most impacted, both in our education and the ways we do our political education, as well as how we do our teaching, how we do our learning, and how we organize? When we teach about Gaza, when we teach about Gaza, are we centering the voices from Gaza? When we engage in political education on migrant justice, are we drawing on the lessons and struggles of the current organizations representing bases on the front lines of that movement? Are we engaging in rigorous study to learn from movements of the past? After all, we can't really understand the current moment without understanding our past, and we can't vision for the future without understanding these conditions. And for me, that's really what makes organizing more powerful, more intentional, and allows us to understand power and the conditions we're in around right-wing authoritarianism, to take up the questions of fascism and genocide. Then we really got to be serious about the how, not just the what. I also think about how knowledge travels through our communities. It's like in the stories, in the lessons we pass down, the debriefs we have after campaign wins or losses, the youth who carry forward the legacy of our elders and historical movements. To broaden our movements, we really have to create more space for that kind of political storytelling and collective memory. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately, as we realize so much of the work we've done hasn't actually been meaningfully documented. Mm-hmm. And sharing what we've learned also means being honest about our mistakes. In the words of Cabral, claim no easy victories, tell no lies. Only an honest assessment allows for real solutions. And that's how we deepen movements, through principled struggle, humility, and lastly, just to end on the question of solidarity. At the heart of all of this is solidarity. And true solidarity isn't just about showing up. It's about learning across struggles, building with people who are fighting different systems of oppression, arguably perhaps the same systems of oppression from different vantage points, and understanding how truly our liberation is tied together. Collective liberation necessitates us to understand in this moment that what we are witnessing in Gaza is a struggle against war and apartheid, but also for economic and political democracy, for education, healthcare for all, for right relations to land, for social justice, gender justice, climate justice. That is really when we're asking ourselves, what does it mean to teach and understand what's happening in Gaza It's really allowing us the space to understand the moment we are in and the world we are building and the world we're fighting against. And our commitment to Palestinian human rights and self-determination has to be part of our broader commitment to racial and social justice. It has to be a reflection of our anti-racist, anti-fascist, anti-colonial values. So when we're calling for an end to US aid to Israel, we're emboldening calls to abolish ICE, to abolish prisons, to defeat fascism. We are expanding the capacity of all working people to shape and determine the economic and political priorities of the society they build. And we know we can't fight for Palestine without fighting against all forms of militarism, racism, and economic exploitation. So education offers us the tools to understand that necessity through the histories of struggle, imagining ourselves as part of that ongoing struggle, and imagining how and what we need to do to build a different world.
Yes, thank you so much, Laura. Mary, what are your thoughts?
So I'm so glad the title has the word pedagogy in it, and the first question is, how do our pedagogies impact or ground our organizing? Because we all operate from a pedagogy, whether we're cognizant of it or even understand what our pedagogy is or not. So how we organize is just as critical to what we organize around. You know, the pedagogy that informs how we organize is just one determinant of our success and our longevity as a movement. I'm Arab American. I grew up in a large Lebanese community in Massachusetts, but I was in a city of 50,000 people. And so in the public schools, my basal reader, and I'm aging myself, was Dick and Jane, and it represented white supremacy culture. And I remember scribbling in the book and making faces and being so angry, and I couldn't figure out why I was so mad at Dick and Jane. But that actually drove me to be a teacher. And that's where I developed an anti-racist pedagogy that was informed by Freire, by the constructivist education movement. And then I brought that work into my Palestine solidarity work and my union organizing. So it's very much what Laura said really resonates with me. I want to describe what that could look like in some detail. First, when we identify our own stories and our lived experiences, we can connect them to each other's stories. And that's how we break the isolation and cut through some of the fear. Then that allows us to build a broader analysis of power. And when we have that, we're more prepared to challenge the systems and the structures of power, be they white supremacy, patriarchy, colonization, Zionism, white nationalism, you know, you name it. So here's an example. When I was the president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, I made a commitment to spend as much time in the locals as I could visiting buildings. This was between 2018 and 2022, and this was right before the pandemic and then through the pandemic. But I would spend time in elementary school buildings where teachers were feeling bullied by their principal. And instead of me walking in with a rhetoric and an analysis, we'd bring people together and we'd sit in a circle and they would tell their experiences of how they were being bullied by this principal. And for some of them, that was the first time they ever told their story. And they didn't know other people had a similar experience. So it was through that dialogue that Freire talks about that people began to connect their experiences. And then we could talk about power. We could talk about the hierarchy of who's in control here. What's their race and their gender? Often it was white men, right? What are the tactics that they're using to keep us isolated, not talking to each other across the building, and keep us afraid? And once they had that engaged in that conversation and developed that analysis, then we started talking about collective action. So what are you willing to do as the first step? And then we went through that process that Laura talked about. They'd take an action, we'd come back and we'd reflect. How did it go? What was successful? Do we need to go back and revise, or are we ready for the next step? And this is one way that we build our power on one small issue, but it's also the way we build our power through collective action in our movements. And let me just say one more thing about the space, some of the spaces that I'm operating in now around Palestine. In our I also found a caucus MTA rank and file for Palestine, which is right here in Massachusetts, as well as being part of the NEA Educators for Palestine. We think about collective leadership. So there isn't one person who makes all the decisions. Again, we come together, we deliberate, we figure out who's got what strengths, and we tap into it. And then how do we share the work? Whether it's who's going to write the new business items that we're moving at our general assemblies, to who's going to speak to them, to who's going to, do the simple grunt work like make the flyers, print the flyers, who's ready to speak, to do the tabling and the flyering, the one-on-one conversation. And within that process, we're also learning from each other. So it becomes the collective wisdom of the group. One last thing I want to say about learning, and something that Laura also touched upon. I had an elder in the Arab movement. She's still alive. She's in her 90s. The thing she always used to say to us when we were young activists was, I'm going to impart into you the knowledge I have about history and how we struggled. But you're going to find a way to do it differently, and you'll find ways that are even better. So I think it's really important that intergenerational organizing happens with mutual respect. Younger generations have to understand and respect that their elders have knowledge of the battle and the history and the stories and the community. And us as elders, and I'm not saying all you are elders, but look at the color of my hair. Those of us who are elders, we have an obligation to also learn from the youth, support them, but know that we don't know it all, and they're going to find new and creative ways to organize and have different kinds of successes than what we had in our generation.
Yes. Well, and you can even think of intergenerational solidarity, that same building collective strength, building on collective knowledge. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So Maya, what are your reflections on pedagogy organizing with your work with the union, with your work as a classroom teacher?
Thank you. Yeah, my vision for education is pretty much entirely rooted in the same philosophy and vision for organizing. Basically, just the idea that we are human beings in process, and that we grow through conversations or dialogue with other human beings. So, like other educators who see education as a way to transform society. I will be the third panelist in a row to mention the work of Paulo Freire. But also, I feel very influenced by James Baldwin and Grace Lee Boggs. From Baldwin, and I think this speaks to Mary's point about intergenerational activism and organizing. Baldwin's writings, I feel like, really instilled in me like the importance of the value of history and seeing ourselves as active participants in the making of history, that history is part of us. We embody it. We literally embody the history of the people who came before us. From Freire, obviously, just tremendous liberatory potential in learning about myself and learning about others. The praxis cycle that I think really aligns with the work of Grace Lee Boggs and her political theories, that we are essentially evolving, right? Each time that we act and then reflect, it brings us to this higher state of consciousness, or it's part of an evolutionary process where we improve as people and as a society. So each time we resolve a contradiction, I hear sometimes people talk about, well, we need to hold the contradiction. And I try to push back and say, well, it's on us, right? As activists, as organizers, to resolve it, to push it. And that's how we take kind of that leap forward or to the next step, kind of building power, as Laura mentioned. I also just want to say that, as educators, every time that we are attacked within the Educator Defense Network, which is a group of folks that I helped kind of found and be part of, and we support educators who have been doxxed by right-wing activists for their political activism. Every single time we experience a right-wing attack, we get a lot stronger. And I really want to reinforce that and make sure that that is a public and understood statement. So these attacks have been opportunities to reach out to groups like Unión del Barrio, Stop LAPD Spying, Jewish Voice for Peace. CARE has helped support us, Drop the ADL, obviously Parceo. And we've started connecting with other unions. So Meeting Mary, talking to folks from CTU and OEA. These are opportunities for us, rather than, feeling like this is it, we're intimidated into silence. We're actually finding that these are the conversation starters. And that's a contradiction, right? The very strategies that they're using to weaken us and to isolate us are actually making us stronger and more connected. So I think that because Palestine brings together so many other struggles for justice and liberation, right? Racism, white supremacy, queerphobia, capitalism, we have the opportunity to have literal dozens of conversations with other educators and activists. And that to me is like, we know what we're doing is powerful, or they would not be working so hard to shut us down. And I try to remember that every time I start to get really discouraged, is like, if my voice didn't matter, you would not be trying to take it away.
Exactly. So I'd like to turn to Mizue and your thoughts on the correlation connection between pedagogy and organizing.
Yeah, I'm going to build off of the point Laura made about the importance of storytelling and sharing campaign work and learning from that. One of the campaigns that I was involved in 2017 is the reason why I actually started an organization focused on taking on surveillance field governance, but very much in working very closely in partnership with movements to both understand the power so we can build the power. So I'm just going to go through this little story. In 2014, I was part of an organization that was one of many dozens of organizations that was pulled together by the then Mayor de Blasio administration in New York City to build a municipal ID for mostly undocumented New Yorkers, but also gender nonconforming people and anyone who had issues getting a state issued ID. But it really was an ID for all New Yorkers. And, the work that we did, or my focus there, was to make sure that in addition to being as inclusive as possible, it was as secure as possible, from surveillance and policing and otherwise. And so that happened. And then a few years later, in 2017, while New York City was being sued by some Republican Congress members to turn over any documents anyone had shared to get a municipal ID, we found out on Twitter that the city was actively trying to put a smart chip or RFID chip on this municipal ID system through an RFP, request for proposal. It would be a way for the city to connect all the medical records that anyone would have in the city, any subway rides people took, homeless shelter stays if you were unhoused. And then it would have like a financial mechanism on it, a financial technology feature where your ID could function as basically like a debit card in place of actual banking solutions for unbanked communities. As we were organizing around this, we actually found out, even though it was an RFP, it wasn't really a competitive bidding situation, but a proposal that was being carefully cultivated by some corporate interests. And really pushing forward technological solutions, surveillance-laden solutions, to address deep-rooted structural inequities. And so, a part of the challenge here was that the technology provided a narrative that it was convenient, efficient, and maybe equitable. But what was masked was the point that it also is very convenient and efficient ways for police and corporations to access data on millions of New Yorkers. And it was a really hard organizing fight. We received a lot of pushback from the city that you're not technical experts, you're afraid of progress, everyone's already being surveilled, so why does it matter? And then we were also told that there's no way that this should happen. We had no say in what could happen because it was already under procurement, and that's kind of like a black box process. So the way we were able to win is we connected movements, a wide range, immigrant rights, community banking, credit unions, financial justice, transit rights, disability rights, anti-policing, health equity, bodily autonomy. It was a very broad ranging campaign, and we were able to develop a collective analysis around the underlying power and make an agenda that thrives by being obscured, more visible. And so what I learned from this is that it's not a given that people will recognize and fight back against the ways the government embraces technologies that fuel state and corporate power. And it requires like a ton of research, education, and organizing, but you have to do it in such a way that resonates with people. And then this point of close collaborations across movement partners and finding interventions in spaces where they really don't want you to have a say and want you to be left in the dark. And then kind of reinforcing a point that was made earlier, we have to really do hard work of collectively reimagining what not only security and safety is, but what democracy could be. And so part of the sharing back of this work resulted in the anthology that me and my co-editors put out with Haymarket, Resisting Borders, and Technologies of Violence. And it does feature case studies of campaigns. So the campaign Laura worked on, Stop Urban Shield, is also featured in there. So I just wanted to add that because I think part of the point of the anthology and this work is to make sure we connect the dots between, the border and internal policing, digital ID systems, smart cities, and fights like for Palestine. And so you can find it in the anthology. But thank you.
Wonderful story and a wonderful reminder of how often innovations which are presented as helping the marginalized or helping the poor are indeed being used to control them. So thank you for making that point so well. Finally, Rebecca. Oh, I think you're muted.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, I'm thrilled to be in conversation with such brilliant people. And I was having some technical difficulties before, so I missed some of what was said, but I heard several other people mention Freire, which is also sort of my starting off point, because I really am also coming to this from the perspective of an organizer more than an educator. And I also sort of have approached political education as being part of the broader context always of organizing, and that it's most powerful when it's one element that reinforces organizing and taking action. And I have also, just in terms of stories to tell, I have two examples I wanted to discuss. One's from Funding Freedom, which I think I'm going to cover now in this first round, and then maybe I'll come back to the second one. And there's different audiences, different eras, different urgencies. The second story is from JVP becoming process of becoming anti-Zionist in 2018. So different methodologies, different audiences, different eras, like I was saying. And I don't want to offer them as like a binary of one being right and one being wrong, but like both as illustrations of this idea that political education is most powerful when it's tied to action, though what that means looks different depending on the circumstances. So Funding Freedom, again, we're a project that is trying to organize within philanthropy to support Palestinian liberation. We actually launched in the last week of September in 2023. So we had to really be emergent in the way that we approached our work, given that October 7th happened right after that. And we were right after October 7th, again, we were trying to build an audience within philanthropy. And so we decided to have right away a series of webinars for philanthropic practitioners. And I think we did, a lot right in that case. Part of our pedagogy was just by the guests that we chose. We had only Palestinian speakers throughout the entire series. And so I think that we showed just by doing that Palestinian perspectives didn't need to be like mitigated or balanced by Jewish or Israeli perspectives. And we called that series Palestinian Realities Before October 7th. And so the framing was really important too, just to remind people, again, this was like in November of 2023. It was shockingly hard in spaces like philanthropy to remind people that this story in no way started on October 7th. So just that framing alone was sort of bracing and challenging for people, which is, a little bit sad, but it's also true. It was like what we were dealing with. And it offered education and context in a moment where people were really desperately looking for it. So we had really great turnout. Hundreds of people registered and attended, even though we were pretty new and unknown. And we pitched it to a broad audience. So people came whose issue areas in quotes. We all know that issue areas are not in isolation, but a lot of people came whose work up to that point had not touched on Palestine. So we were sort of able to weave together how climate justice and reproductive justice and indigenous rights and immigrant rights all connect to one another and all connect to Palestinian liberation. But even as it was happening, we realized that we wanted to like not just offer a history lesson, but to tie the educational offerings to the concrete conditions within philanthropy, which were very dire at the time. We were seeing like terminated, and still are, terminated grants, forced silencing, that sort of thing. So our method kind of evolved with each session so that by the end, we were adding a portion when people could break up into groups and discuss their own work based on what they'd heard and what actions they plan to take. And then ultimately, we added a sort of capstone session that brought together philanthropic practitioners to talk about what the responsibilities and potential actions were based on the political circumstances and what they learned in the series. So it was very dynamic in that sense. And I think it was a good series and we were proud of it. And I think it answered a real need, and it really helped to gather and help people find community and gather courage between people who felt pretty isolated in their own institutions. And some of those people who came to those initial series have really remained grounded in the work today, and they've become active in formations like Funders for Palestine that were emerging at the same time. But I would say that one thing we learned was that people in philanthropy, maybe in particular, but maybe not, like really love to be educated. They're like happy to come to a webinar or a workshop and leave feeling like they've done the work to open their minds and learn new things. And that of course is good, but it's not enough. And so in reflecting on the series afterward, we felt that was kind of that kind of broad-based call with no structures for action or accountability were not really sufficient. And honestly, not really worth the time and effort we had taken to put them together if they weren't tied to something ongoing. So that like sparked our shift to more of what we call a cohort model. We're still occasionally offering broad-based political education opportunities, but we're putting much more effort into these cohorts. That's of course not a new idea. We're about to start our second round. And we did do a lot of recruitment for the cohorts from that original audience. So it flowed into the cohorts, the original broad education we had done. And in fact, there was even like some agitational organizing moments in that some people couldn't get permission last year to come to the cohort, but spent the year convincing their institutions and are now joining this year instead. So that in and of itself was a sort of educational and organizing win. And we very specifically designed the cohort to include that each participant commit to both personal and collective projects and goals. So we did do ongoing education throughout the year of the cohort, but we also really focused on what we could move within the philanthropic sector as a group and at the institutions where the participants were located. And then for Funding Freedom itself, this is part of a larger multi-year goal of building a set of people who are educated, network to one another, share an analysis, and are committed to supporting Palestinian liberation within philanthropy to the extent that that's possible, and growing that network over time. So the political education work is key, but it's also really one part of a larger organizing goal. So I think I'll pause there. And like I said, I have a complementary example to share in our next go round.
Great. Thank you so much, Rebecca, and to all of you. So, for the second round, we already talked a lot about political education and how it's impacting organizing. But I'm also interested in what the challenges you face or that you see our movements facing in elevating our commitments and principles and actions, especially in this time when, as you've all mentioned, there has been so much suppression of not just organizers, but of educators. And so again, I will kick it off with Laura.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think there's challenges on every level, and education isn't immune to that in this moment. And it's helpful for me to start with making a distinction. And this panel has really helped me and provoked me to think about this more around the distinction between political education and education. Mm-hmm. And political education isn't meant simply to like inform our work. It's really meant to sharpen and guide our work as organizers, as movements. And the way we do it and is really helping us to understand our conditions, our capacities, our agencies, and consciously in that process, developing a theory to understand the world we are in. and for that theory then to animate kind of the force of action we take up, right? So I start by saying that because what's really important is to remind ourselves each and every day that, pedagogical work is not abstract knowledge. It's about freedom, it's about liberation, it's about change. And learning is not neutral, right? It's rooted in the present conditions we are in time, place, and conditions, and always reflecting the aspirations and conditions of the people most marginalized, most impacted by the societies and systems that we are up against. So whether it's the hands of dictatorships, manipulations of capitalism, the cruelty of racism, patriarchy, all the systems of oppression are interconnected, and our pedagogy has to expose, challenge, and dismantle those systems, not just in thought, but in practice. And at this moment, we really need to be using all our educational tools and pedagogies to address the root causes of the conditions that we are in. And education in that way becomes a form of not just understanding the world, but changing it. And why that's so important when we think about challenges. We are literally up against a concerted effort at every level, local, state, and federal, to censor education, to make sure that stories aren't told, that we aren't allowed to tell them. And if we do tell them, that we face criminalization, penalization, or worse, right? So there's endless resources being poured in divide and conquer tactics right now. There's endless resources being poured in erasing our solidarity from our collective memory, having us fight over breadcrumbs, blaming one another, right, for the misery that's unleashed on us, or thinking that our individual issues, sectors, causes, right, are at odds with others facing the same system of oppression. So going back to the biggest challenge today is to constantly root ourselves and guide ourselves in joint struggle, in solidarity, in collective liberation, whatever you want to call it, right? It is our political and pedagogical horizon is that solidarity put into practice. And so I think for us as movements for social justice, we have been all, like our movements for justice, I would imagine all of us here are really putting everyone on notice, whether that's philanthropy, as Rebecca spoke about, decision makers, institutions, education, educators. Everybody must take up the challenge to do better, to do different, to ensure that we are investing in life and justice and divesting from harm. And we are hopeful that there's shifts in this moment, right? That we are going to make sure that we move past the times where we are all falling into complicity in the systems of oppression that we so deeply want to fight against. And I'll end by saying on this point that, solidarity truly is a moral imperative, but it's also a necessary way of life if we're committed to change in the course of history. Like, we need to understand that if we're serious about changes, we have to understand that our solidarity is the way forward. And we have so much work to do, whether it was the founders of ethnic studies who built out an educational system that would in fact deal with the questions of race and power that now is under attack across the country, and even right here in my own state of California, that we still have work and the task to take up to ensure that we are doing everything necessary to raise consciousness, to build solidarity and empathy, and put that into action in order to do what's necessary right now to change the world. And the United States and us being in the belly of the beast gives us that responsibility and task.
All right. Thanks so much. Mary, back to you.
Laura, that was amazing. I want to touch, Maya said something really critical. She talked about the internal contradictions. And one of the biggest challenges I think we face is the unresolved. I love, Maya, how you said people are talking about contradictions, but not trying to resolve them. They must be resolved, right? The unresolved internal contradictions in movements, especially movements that espouse anti-racism principles and rhetoric, but they don't reflect a multiracial community. Sometimes they act in ways that are contrary to those anti-racist principles, and they're not introspective about that. The Palestinian exception is still a big part of those internal contradictions on the left. We all hear that term PEP, progressive except for Palestine. Well, we're starting to say left except for Palestine, right? I'm part of another progressive caucus that I was a founder of, and it's breaking my heart because many of the individuals take actions as individuals and participate in the Palestine solidarity movement, but the caucus itself won't do any active organizing because there's a belief that we either have to take it slow, or we don't want to upset the Zionists inside the left caucus, or it's divisive, so we have to be really cautious. We know what Dr. King said about gradualism. It's the same thing. We have a board of directors inside the MTA that has actually been fantastic. They've moved the agenda coming from the MTA rank and file for Palestine, but the agenda is stalling, and the agenda is an agenda of protecting academic freedom and our physical safety. But then leadership stalls. So where's the hope in that? We formed MTA rank and file for Palestine because we actually found so many MTA members who never got involved in MTA as their union wanting to be part of it now because they see MTA members active on Palestine. Same thing with the NEA caucus that we built. All of the sudden, we started as an Arab American caucus that had, you can count on one hand how many anti-Zionist Jews there were, and then on the other hand, how many Arabs there were. And then after, October 7th, all of these unionized educators just came out and they wanted to participate. So it's back to why the political education matters, because without that political education, individuals, institutions that are supposed to be progressive and fighting institutions, and society conform and uphold these systems of power. Political education is the vehicle that leads us towards liberation by understanding how to dismantle these systems. And the important thing I want to end with on political education is it can be done in any way, in any place, at any time. It can be done one-on-one, changing one person at a time. It can be done by being in a general assembly of a union and listening to a speech at a microphone in favor of a new business item. I want to tell this amazing story that happened when NEA for Palestine moved the new business item inside our General Assembly to drop the ADL. I was standing at a microphone, ready to speak in favor of our new business item. There was another woman standing at the same microphone. She was asked by the Jewish American caucus, which really only has an Israeli agenda, not a Jewish agenda, to defer her time at the microphone to somebody in the Jewish American caucus so they could speak against the motion. This woman had a moment of political education when she heard one of the NEA for Palestine members at the microphone explain ADL's history on assaults against the Black Lives Matter movement, and her jaw dropped and she turned to me and she said, "Why am I standing here to pass the microphone to somebody who opposes dropping the ADL?" And she stepped away from the microphone. She wouldn't do it, right? So that's an example of how we can change people's minds one at a time. But we also have to be intentional about the work of doing it informally. We did a lot of tabling and talking at the NEA. We had morning caucuses of our state delegations where we did the political education. All of this is designed to help people understand intersectionality, such as the kidnapping of Mahmoud Khalil and Mohsen Madawi and Rumeysa Ozturk sit at the intersection of the assault on the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, on immigrants, on birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment, the First Amendment, academic freedom, right? And so much more. So people are more open now than ever. And I think it's because of the moment, because we are emerging into a new moment of fascism, and genocide is live streaming in their phones and devices.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Mary. Maya, I also, because you are in a classroom, one of the questions that came up was, how can we do this? How can we do this activism and political education in the classroom? It looks like you're, oh, there you are. Okay.
Yeah, my video keeps going in and out, but I haven't lost anyone speaking yet. So I'm hoping that the sound is going through. I think it starts with those questions. I actually, we have a whole, we call it Know Your Fight over Know Your Rights, because rights are won and taken away. They're a constant battle. So we have a Know Your Fight presentation as Educator Defense, which I am more than happy if folks want to look up our Instagram and message us to get the conversation started, to present to educators. But it is really rooted in that dialogue, which also kind of ties into some of my thoughts on the next question around how do we engage with this, right? Whether we're classroom educators or we're in our union spaces or we're at our school sites. I think really it comes down to human beings having this very real fear of isolation. And as I've observed, Zionists or white supremacists attack us, that is really what they're trying to do, is make you feel like you are alone, nobody likes you, you are wrong, and just shame, 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 shame. And the antidote to shame is love and community, right? And so building up a community, I mean, we see that fear of isolation in lawmakers, in the AB 715 fight. That's what I saw, is that they agreed with us. They just didn't want to be the only one or the first one. There was no brave, principled leadership. It was just this deep-rooted, very, understandable fear of being alone. So two things on that. One is, to Mary's point about visibility, right? Wearing the keffiyeh was so important and continues to be so important because you find your people through that. Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about in his book, The Message, this woman who stood up at one of his book talks and yelled at him. And I think about, I like literally got a chill, because that must have taken immeasurable courage, but she transformed his thinking on an issue. She got under his skin and he reflected and he traveled and he wrote The Message, which in turn, how many, folks who were kind of in the more liberal, progressive, except Palestine, reaching that audience, having his platform, really beautiful and amazing work, that work of transformation. So that's the first thing I think, is that visibility is key. And then the second thing is to understand like sort of the human element, the dialogue element we've talked about with Frere, the patience, which is killer when you're talking, like literally killing people. When you're talking about a genocide, I know so many of us have struggled, but understanding these systems of Zionism, of racism, of imperialism, the idea of, Western hegemony, like these are deeply ingrained in us from before we are born. And so unlearning them takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of care. I think we have to practice a lot of self-discipline, a lot of political discipline to make good on our values and say, other people are worth that time and that care to me, right? Know when to take care of yourself and end the conversation, but then always keeping that open so that as they leave that conversation, they'll continue to think about the things you said. I mean, think about like, for Coates, it took years, right? Literal years for him to come to a place where he was ready to do that learning. So as educators, we are always educating. That's something we've done a lot of in our union, is just the constant making sure the lines of communication are open, no matter how angry we get. That to me is the self-discipline, that if I can see, Palestinian activists and leaders continue to just hold their heads up with dignity and speak on the mic at our union gatherings, then I can practice that same self-discipline and that same persistence. But we've contacted our leaders and really, really tried to make it a conversation where there is some kind of basic human understanding, right? We know you believe in racial justice, in equality, in human rights. We know that you're not for apartheid and genocide. How can we work together to make sure that our union is acting in a principled way? Or what do you need? What do you need in order to be brave? What do you need to act on your values? What can we do to help you get to that place? So I think it is a process, but I am reminded over and over, particularly from my elders, that it's the work of generations. And I always feel like if Palestinians can do it, then I have no right to be short-sighted or to give up.
Yes, indeed. And I love what you said about visibility, finding your people, but also visibility gives other people the ability to stand up. It lets them know it is a form of education in itself, letting them know that there are others who think that way and that it's giving them room to disagree. Mizue, what are your thoughts?
Thanks. I'll try to be fast because we're coming up on the hour. In terms of the question of the challenge, like we are facing a moment of transformational violence where things that have been building up for decades, centuries are reaching, I think, what is it? The bar is going lower. And I think, it's really hard, right? We have to move really fast, but the work that we need to do has to be really slow and intentional. And I'll just quote Cabral again. This idea that like we must learn from the past but not live in it, I think is a real challenge for this moment in terms of actually thinking about how we got here in order to undo it and like what are the particularities, seeing the continuities, but also seeing the ruptures and divergences so we can break them open towards transformation. And so I'll just talk about this moment of mass deportation at this it's at a scale that we've never experienced. This idea of deporting someone from who was born in Jamaica, from the United States, from Brooklyn all the way to Eswatini, like that's new, right? But the laws that allow that to happen and the infrastructure that allowed it to happen and the ideologies have been built up steadily over time. And, one of the things I just want us to think about is, as we challenge it, let's not fall into binaries that will legitimate it existing, right? Like this idea of like the worst of the worst, and then people being like, well, these people got deported and they're not even criminals, right? Did this idea even evolve that broad categories of people could be forever criminalized? And also that it's legitimate for them to be, massively expelled or excluded from their homes and where they'd like to live in their communities. So just to wrap up quickly, I think, one of the things that is new about this moment as we think about surveillance-fueled governance is how rapidly technology is evolving and innovating and how innovation is so closely tied to the national economy and a state investment in scales of policing and repression and incarceration, deportation, exclusion that is particularly of this moment. But then also the astounding concentration of wealth and power in tech corporations and tech moguls. And I guess not to just say something that feels so big, but I think it's really important, the points to reinforce what other speakers have talked about. It's like we just can't throw around our ideas and our thinking. We have to meet people where they are and really build our work grounded in reciprocal forms of knowledge production and exchange with movement partners and the communities that they build with. And I just wanted to end with something a little more upbeat, a quote from Ruthie Wilson Gilmore in the anthology, where in an interview she says, "The good thing is, if there are many dimensions, it means there are lots of ways to fight. Every dimension is an opportunity for a campaign or an organization or a struggle and for a win." Thank you.
Thank you. And wonderful to have that inspiring thought. Rebecca, I know you have faced a lot of challenges in your organizing. We faced some of them together. So what are your thoughts on that and the role, how that connects to political education?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Lesley, like I said, I want to talk a little bit about JVP's process of becoming anti-Zionist in 2018, and you were part of that process. So you might have other comments or recollections. And I really just appreciate listening to all of you. I feel like I got a name for this process that I didn't have before from Mary and Maya, which is really, it was a process of resolving our own internal contradictions organizationally when we went through that process. So JVP in those days was smaller than it is now. It still had about at least 10,000 members. This was like after the 2014 attack on Gaza, and we had grown exponentially, kind of in a similar way as we had have now, not at such a big scale, but as what's, it's similar to what has been happening over the past 2 years in terms of the growth in membership. And there's like a lot of things to say about the external political circumstances and our obligations to and our expectations of our partners. Lara would have, I think, could speak to that. But I wanted to just sort of stay focused on that internal process, which was also a decision-making process. And most of it was not publicly evident. And JVP even then had multiple constituencies within it. So like the rabbis and the students, for example, had very different experiences and sort of subcommittees who they felt responsible to, and they had much different risk-taking factors that they had to account for. And the people who were doing street protests had different worries than the people who were doing lobbying of legislators. So there were different concerns and sort of conditions that people were responding to. And people were also, frankly, working through a lot of emotions. A lot of people had grown up in Zionist families and communities, and were worried about how to break with that, and what the personal consequences would be of breaking with that. And so this process was also a preparatory process for that. And so we were like aware of needing both to educate people about what Zionism actually is, the impact, of course, that it has on Palestinians, but also on Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews and Jews of color inside of Israel, on the ways it's sort of almost universally just, I lost you guys for a second, sorry. Like the way it's almost destroyed, vibrant Jewish languages like Yiddish. So we really wanted to like create a space where people could both learn and disentangle their feelings. And we wanted to offer that within JVP, so we wouldn't be relying on our Palestinian partners to hold that emotion and processing. So just to say that process was pretty intense, and it utilized the structures that we already had within JVP. So like chapters had their own discussions, and constituency groups had their own discussions, and we offered chances for individual members to meet online, and we had online discussions for the whole membership, and we had in-person discussions for the whole membership at our national membership meetings. We had different mediums for people to express their reflections. Like we had an online zine that I remember being really incredibly moving, as people like contributed words and art to express their journey of struggle and commitment to moving away from Zionism. And it was really a multi-year process. It was definitely too slow for some people. But when we finally did make the decision to become anti-Zionist, we didn't lose anyone. And even people who were uncomfortable with the decision understood it accurately reflected the vast majority's position. So it was also like that way of being public to each other and understanding where the membership was part of the process. And everybody's opportunities to learn and reflect meant they were able to sort of live with that decision. And I think also by taking the time we needed to do the deep work of coming to an informed analysis within the organization, it meant that when we needed to after October 7th, we could hit the streets right away. Like there wasn't a struggle over our political positioning. We had clarity. We had that internal reflection moment that Mary and Maya were talking about, where we resolved those internal contradictions. So I think like that speaks to designing a process that's thorough and multi-pronged and has many different methods and formations as possible, and allowed both for the education piece and the emotional piece in this case, and that it was not being done in a vacuum, but was part of a political project that we needed to do to bring us back to the beginning, to build power and show up for our partners and do our work most effectively.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So we have, I believe, responded to all of the questions that we've gotten in the chat. So instead of having a longer question and answer session, I'd just like to invite each of our panelists to give maybe 1 minute kind of summing up or final thought that you really want people to take away from this amazing conversation. So once again, let's start with Lara.
I mean, just drawing on what everybody said, the fact that education is under such attack by all forces that be should tell us the role it plays, right, in really driving our movements forward and our interests of the working class people across this country. So would hope we continue to invest in our educators, our teachers, Parceo, institutions that are trying to do different. And I think it's really critical that right now we show solidarity with all those who are standing up and speaking out despite the attempts to silence.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Laura. Mary.
We are in another moment in history that we've been in before. The details look different, and we don't yet know. History will tell us how to compare this moment to the past because we're at the start of the moment. We don't know how bad it's going to get yet. We can anticipate. But having said that, we have to be able to learn from the past. We have to always understand what solidarity is and grow solidarity, broaden intersectionality. I have to say, despite the genocide, the loss that's not justifiable to the Palestinians, in my lifetime, I have never seen a Palestinian solidarity movement this broad and this sustained around the world. And people are starting to make connections between all of the struggles that Palestine represents. And so we can't lose hope because we will become paralyzed. But we also have to be practical and not have rose-colored glasses on either. And we find love and compassion and power and courage in each other and in the work we do together.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Mary. Maya.
Yeah, I want to just affirm all the classroom educators and school site educators and tell you that you're in the right place. I know that there's a lot of doubts, especially when you see the scale of the problems, and then you kind of are in the same place all day with kids who may or may not be very interested in global events. But Bell Hooks talks about the classroom being the most radical space in the institution. By just being there and being able to talk to students like they matter, you are teaching them. You are teaching them that there are ways to think about things beyond a right or wrong binary. You are modeling someone who is in process, and you are also growing when you engage in this process with students. I am not the same educator that I was 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. And sometimes it comes down to daily interactions with young people who are bringing things to me and pushing me to grapple with the new realities that they are growing up with. There's no evasion when you're a classroom educator, right? The problems of the world are yours to face with very limited resources, but it is a magical process. And then a mentor of mine in Union del Barrio, he'll often quote that the teacher who is fighting is also teaching. So I never want any of us to think that, and I didn't, impose my Spanish on anybody there, but it sounds much better when he says it. But essentially, just knowing that your students are learning from you all the time. They don't disappear when they graduate. They continue to see you. I ran into a student at Office Depot, and he said, "I saw you on the news." And so it's those little things where right, that you are a presence in someone's life. And even though it can be very scary to be an educator who is down for Palestine, who is out for trans rights, who is standing up for Black students and Black history, just know that that is a worthwhile place to be.
Very true. Thank you so much, Maya. Mizue.
I would love everything everybody had said. I feel like this point around fighting alongside and supporting public schools and universities as spaces for sites of critical learning and cultivating possibilities is really critical, especially as we see the ascendancy of AI in schools and all the things. So I just wanted to reinforce that. And then building on what Mary said, always, it's difficult times, but there have been difficult times for a long time. And people persevere, they struggle, and they sacrifice. And I feel so honored to be in the space with all of you, fierce fighters, and appreciation for the work of Parceo, because these are the types of communities and collaborations and lessons that we have to learn and share across. So I'll end with that, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Mizue. And finally, Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really appreciate the distinction that Laura made between political education and education. And I'm so glad that this conversation sort of had a range of people doing different kinds of education in different spaces and in different ways. I found that incredibly useful and very classic of Parceo in terms of thinking about all the different ways that education happens. And, I think in terms of political education specifically, when you're doing it in the context of organizing, I am just thinking again about the metrics of what I was just talking about earlier, that political education is part of a broader project of leadership development and building power and ultimately how to do our work more effectively. And so that when we're thinking about how we do political education and why we do it, political education, we need to use those things as the metrics for the things that we're taking on.
All right. Well, thanks again to all 5 of our extraordinary panelists. And I am going to turn it over to our Parceo co-director, Nina Maida, to close us out. So go ahead, Nina.
Okay, thank you all so much for sharing your brilliant experiences and pedagogies for justice and thinking together about how they impact your organizing, our organizing. As Lesley said, part of Parceo's work as a center that is rooted in principles of PAR, or participatory action research, has been co-creating curricula for justice to deepen our reflection and analysis toward critical action against genocide, against racial capitalism and its manifestations, against false accusations of anti-Semitism, and to be able to disrupt some of the normalization of destructive narratives that further injustice so that we can create and promote liberatory frameworks. Thank you so much, Lesley, Lara, Mary, Maya, Mizue, and Rebecca for sharing your disruptions, your co-creations, and amplifying our interrelated struggles, from immigration defense and deportation defense to education defense, ending military funding while funding movements for justice in Palestine. Because this, as you've all shared, is how we build, by reflecting and taking action and sharing what we learn to deepen our movements. Today we heard what it means to think and act critically for justice, to make interventions, to slowly and urgently push against authoritative control, surveillance, corporate and financialized control. We know it takes risk. And also we know how the terrain is not only threatened, but the language around our values, like critical thinking, is, they're co-opted. So clarifying and giving life to these pedagogies and actions for justice is so critical. We really value spaces like this to come together across our different movements to reveal oppressive structures so that we can not only shut them down, but build our movements for justice, for real safety, free from oppression and exploitation. We know that the interrelated threats and interconnected struggles offer possibilities for, as so many of you shared, for building solidarities and interdependent power. This is where we have to be right now. And thank you, Lesley, so much for moderating. Besides working together with Parceo, Lesley is a part of a number of Jewish and racial equity social justice organizations, a librarian, a writing instructor, a discussion facilitator. Thank you so much. And Donna and I and all of us at Parceo look forward to connecting with everybody here more, and for all of you out there more. And for those watching, please feel free to reach out at info@parceo.org to connect more. And also you can find this video on Haymarket Books YouTube link channel for where you registered, or you can find it from the name of this conversation, Pedagogies for Justice. Thanks again, Haymarket. Thanks again, all of you. We look forward to continuing to build together.